Hello, Level Up listeners. Tonight I am joined by my better half, and we are going to be discussing that something that you guys have been asking me a lot for, but I'm not a pro. So I'm bringing him in. I'm bringing the pro in, and his name is Tom Leland. And here he is. Well, that's our dog, Duke. We call him Dukas. He has been in cybersecurity engineer for over 20 years. And tonight we will be talking about how to prevent yourself from getting hacked, how you can be safer online and prevent your information from being stolen. Take it away, husband.
Well, thank you for that. So there's a lot of different things to unpack. There's a lot of various things we can talk about. Was there anything you wanted me to focus on to start with? Maybe a 101 or anything you'd like me to do, I'd be happy to help you.
Yeah, so we actually had a conversation because a couple of my friends got their information stolen via LinkedIn. And I think one was on email. It was like phishing. And so they were just asking, how do we prevent ourselves from being vulnerable and not get into this? Like, we don't really know how to prevent that from happening. And I said, okay, let me talk to my husband and go from there. So, how does one protect themselves from getting hacked? Like, what is the first step?
Well, it's actually a great question. Today it probably would help just to kind of, for context reasons, kind of, set the table for kind of what we're going to discuss. We live in a really, really sophisticated, complex world where cyber thieves and quote unquote hackers are always trying to steal information. And ideally, the average person who gets online, right, can do so safely. The problem really kind of becomes magnified when we start to look at our own habits as human beings, right? So we tend to want to use the same credentials for every single site, and we tend to be far too trusting. So we'll get a link, for instance, sent to us over SMS, and we'll have more of an inclination to go and click on that link without maybe being suspicious of the source of the link. This is true for things like QR codes. It's true for things like emails. And what happens is then of course the person is taking the first steps at getting phished. And if you don't know what that is, that's essentially sending ostensible emails to people that look like they're legitimate, but they're actually sent by an attacker who's trying to gain access to your credentials so they can get into your bank account or they can get into other sensitive material that person has access to. It could be health information, it could be secrets that are, for instance, guarded by a company's IT infrastructure. There's a lot of different things that follow, but ultimately, what happens is that these techniques are nefarious and they're designed for people to be comfortable. And hey, I'm going to go and click on this link. I'm not even thinking about it, and the next thing you know, you just had your information stolen.
Yeah, it happens. And I think the older population are very vulnerable on it because they don't know anything about like phishing. And even most people don't really know about like phishing. So, is there anything or any way that a regular person would be looking at their email that they would know, like, hey, don't click on this email, especially if it's like your bank, right? Like whatever, Bank of America or whatever bank that you're, Wells Fargo, and it's like, hey, you need to like verify your account, click on this link. Like, is there some type of something that somebody can read and said, oh, better not click on that link?
Yeah, that's a really really good point, and that's actually exactly how these attacks, how they transform. What happens is oftentimes you'll see an email come into your inbox, and it'll have very official looking graphics inside the email, HTML graphics. You'll see things like Bank of America, or you'll see something that looks like your company. And what'll happen is there'll be a link, and the link itself will be obfuscated. So it'll look legitimate just by looking at it. But invariably, if you look a little closer, you'll find that there's some things that are wrong. And typically, what you can do is you can go and look at the source, you can look at the sender, and look at the domain that that email is coming from. So before you go and just click on that link, go up into the sender of the email and just see what that domain is. Is it coming from, bankofamerica.com, bofa.com? Is it coming from a legitimate URL or domain space? So what happens is that if we take a little time before we just click on things, then we can really, it goes a long way in safeguarding just the first part of the fish, which is just to get you to click the link.
Yeah. And once you click on the link, then pretty much they might get your credentials if you're starting to log on there. Um, Great idea. Now, how about if someone basically got their information already? Like, we talked about the reasons. Like, why would someone actually wanting to hack you? You don't even have millions of dollars. But why would they? What's the reason that you've seen out there that people get hacked, like regular people?
Well, again, that's a great question. So one of the things that I think most people don't understand is that their personal identifiable, or what we call PII, personal identifiable information, is very, very valuable on the black market, and it can be anything from just social security numbers. It could down to for instance, just names, email addresses, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things can be sold in bulk lots down in the deep web, and in some extent the dark web. But what ends up happening is that this is all very valuable to people that are trying to, for instance, breach. Like I'll give you an example. If say for instance somebody isn't careful, obviously you may want to go and you want to impersonate someone online. And so, of course, if you have valid credentials and you have, a valid street address and you have a valid name, et cetera, that now becomes very valuable information that someone can use in a so-called or seemingly legitimate attempt, at impersonating someone so they can gain access to a higher level of system.
Mm, that's pretty interesting. Like then they can open credit cards and your name, loans in your
Correct.
name, um, dry your bank account, go to Mexico with it or anywhere in the world, right? But
That's right.
how can you be safer online today? Like, what are the things that one could do as a regular person if and even at their job? I feel like some of these universities that I get, sometimes we get some random emails, and I know it's phishing emails. What can we do to make sure, like, how we're doing it, like passwords and things like that? Can you talk a little bit about, like, what is the safety protocol for
Yeah.
somebody to, like, make sure you're actually clear and it's something that you can do as a habit?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so the first thing that people do, again, and this is all out of comfort, is they'll tend to use their work credentials. They'll tend to use the same credentials at work, say for instance, in their own personal lives. They'll do things that are obviously easier for them, or people don't want to think about passwords. It's the last thing we all want to think about. So one of the things that we can do, the first thing we can do is use what's called a password vault and use what we call complex passwords. So these password vaults are very, very good because number one, you can use one password and store hundreds and hundreds of passwords inside the vault. And this will be typically what we call a triple encrypted vault, or excuse me, or a vault that's encrypted that's very, very difficult to crack itself. And you can store all your passwords there, and they can be complex passwords now because these vaults all have the ability to do what's called autofill in web page forms. So if I go and I land on a page and I want to go and put in my complex password, well, obviously you don't want to type that because you're not going to, number one, that'll take you minutes to do that. Well, now you can literally just select the record right out of the vault. It'll autofill it for you and put your complex password in, and you can have access. So, a couple things. Use a password vault. There's a number of good ones. One of the ones I recommend is mSecure. You can find that in both the Google Play Store for Android and the Apple Store, the App Store, and it's a great thing. And you can obviously sync those passwords so all your devices have access to it. The other thing is that use a complex password, and typically use one that's what I call random or auto generated within the app. So what's nice is that you can actually generate a password for a site within mSecure and then use that when you're signing up for the site. You can obviously go into your profile if you already have existing access to the site and then just change it to a more complex password. But that is a very good way to essentially give yourself an edge, because at that point, you're not using some simple password that any type of a hacker can use a password cracker on to easily guess it. It would take far, far too much time to do that. So
Yeah.
this is a good way to do it. The other thing too is, and I tell people this all the time, is if you're surfing online, using good VPN security software is also good. So now there's several different services. Kaspersky actually is a great choice, and they have an ability there to be able to give you access to essentially what they call secure internet, and what that is that's essentially a VPN connection to what we call a proxy server. And that proxy server essentially impersonates you. It acts on your behalf. And what it does is across the internet, it cloaks your identity so you can surf securely.
Nice. And do they have a cost associated with it? Is it something affordable that anyone can buy, or is it something like super expensive?
Oh, absolutely. I would say everything is very reasonable. Typically, VPN, secure VPN access is going to cost you usually between maybe $30 to $40 per year. And then, of course, these password vaults, if you want some of the higher end functions and you want the ability to back up your passwords and replicate to different devices, you might pay $20 or $25 a year. But what people don't realize is people don't want to spend money on this stuff. But at the end of the day, if you really look at it, your data is worth so much more than this. And if somebody were to be able to completely steal your information and sell it on the deep web, or the dark web, and you were a victim of identity theft, and they ruined your credit, or did other things, you're going to look at maybe that less than $100 a year as an absolute bargain.
Yeah. Rather than like having to make sure your credit gets back, your credit card gets paid, or talk about like doing all the manual work to get that. So that's awesome. So password is the first one. Having the VPN is the second one, which is the insecure. Anything else? Like, can you give us an analogy that you and I were talking about, like the house analogy, and what does like a network? We're talking about like now an individual who might have a small business trying to secure their information online. Like, how should you back up your data? Is there any like something that you can provide information on small business owners to make sure that their clients' information are also secure?
Sure, sure, yeah. That's actually a real key point. Is one of the things that happens and we've all heard about ransomware and cryptojacking and things like that. And so what will happen is that machines will get infected, and they'll they'll be devastated by some heavy duty ransomware, and the next thing you know, somebody's on the phone or with you because they'll provide you instructions to call a number and they'll say you've got to pay X amount of dollars for us to send you the private key to decrypt the machine and get your information back. And these types of attacks can largely be avoided by backing up your data. Just taking really solid, regimented, typical backups that any IT department should be doing on a regular cadence is going to avoid this. I'd say 9 out of 10 of these attacks can be avoided by companies that just have a good backup strategy and a good backup plan. You'll find that it happens in hospitals and it happens in other really, like mission critical type of environments. And it's almost always the negligence of the IT staff that just doesn't have good habits. Something's not working. They don't have a good backup, and then a ransomware attack hits. So that's the first thing I would do is just make sure that because here's what happens. If you've got a good backup strategy and you're backing up everything on incremental backups and you have everything backed up, they could hit you with a ransomware attack and it's not going to really have a whole lot of impact. Now, the other thing people will say is well, what if it's data that isn't necessarily backed up by the company? So, well, that falls on you, right? You want to, first off, people shouldn't be storing company documents on their own drives. That's what we call shadow IT. That's not good either. Okay, or people will share company documents up in, for instance, the SaaS platforms. OneNote, or they'll all these different types of Dropbox or things like that. They'll take a company document and store it there, and of course that's not good either, right? So there are IT solutions to block these shadow IT transactions and then to report that to administrators. So a small business should be looking for those things. And it's all about, it's another vector, for instance, for somebody to steal sensitive company information, have it sitting in an unsecured, SaaS drive, and then somebody can then, of course, break into the SaaS drive, and now they have your company secrets. So we have to try to do whatever we can to try to safeguard that. So that's another thing, make sure that you have a good strategy for the shadow IT use case, but back up all your information locally that you can back up your own data, your own files, things like that. So business owners today have to have some onus to look at what their employees are doing, and they're going to need to talk to their IT teams or essentially cybersecurity vendors to be able to help them out with some of that.
But what if they're a business owner who doesn't have an IT team? Can they just put their backup on Google Drive? Is that even safe?
No, that's another good point. So Google Drive and any of these other drives, I mean, literally 24/7, every second they're under attack. They're constantly being hit because people again are very lax and will take very sensitive information and store it in these drives, thinking that it's safe. But in reality, especially with people that don't use complex passwords, especially with people that are very lax in how they do things, those Google Drives will get hacked, sensitive information will get stolen, and of course that could lead to a theft of intellectual property. So again, this kind of goes back to that you kind of mentioned earlier about like passwords. Well, obviously passwords are just a part of it. One of the ways we can safeguard putting information in the cloud, like Google Drive, et cetera, is using what we call two-factor authentication, right? Where basically we use a good complex password, and then of course we might have a code that so every time you go to log in, essentially a code is sent to an SMS or an email, and then you have to plug that in. But that SMS will point to your particular device. Only you can access it. An email that only you have access to, and then now you have two factors there of authentication. So it makes it much more difficult for a would-be attacker to gain elevated access to that information.
So that's so much better. Like I was just thinking in my head, like, what if they have your phone number? Can they actually like get those codes, because I think they have like an expiration, right? Like you have 30 seconds, or I don't know how long, I don't remember. I think for
Yeah,
Google
exactly.
sometimes. Yeah.
And just for those that out there that don't kind of maybe aren't necessarily following everything we're saying, what we're really talking about here is, obviously if you go to any website or if you go into an application, you try to log in, it's going to ask you for a username and it's going to ask you for your password. And typically what you'll do is you'll enter in your password and that'll be it. You'll log in. Well, two-factor authentication, what CJ's talking about is essentially what you're doing is you're also going to be required to enter in a code, and that code will typically be sent to your cell phone or it'll be sent to an email address that only you have access to. Now, of course, if somebody's already gained access to, say, for instance, an email, et cetera, that can make things difficult, right? Because you still now they can gain access to it. It's not going to make much of a difference. And that's why securing your credentials to begin with good password hygiene and rotating your passwords every so often, storing your passwords in a secure vault, all of that is going to prevent somebody from gaining access to your email but also like your SMS, your phone, that's very difficult, right? Because somebody has to have access to your mobile phone to do that. And so that's why that's such an effective way to implement two-factor authentication.
Yeah, better. And how often would you say, how often should people change their passwords to like a good hygiene for just being a good habit?
Good password hygiene should, obviously passwords should be rotated. Most password changes, especially in some of the better websites, for instance, that force you to do it, they don't want you to use anything that you've used in the past. But to answer your question, I would say every 3 months. It really shouldn't go longer than that because it's easy. Some people say, "Oh, I do it every 6 months." Well, in the world of cyber, that's actually an eternity. So 3 months is really as far out as you want to go.
3 months. That's a good measure for that. Is there anything else that somebody that you could provide to somebody, like, okay, what is a good habit for you to have? We have the password, we have Insecure, right? We have Kaspersky. Is there any additional things that you would say, hey, you should actually try to make sure that this is a good habit for you, especially if you own a business, a small business that you don't have an engineer, dedicated cybersecurity guys, that you can afford to do? Like, what other tools that you could provide for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things that makes cybersecurity so interesting is that the methods and the techniques are always evolving, and it makes it very difficult for any business owner, whether they're a small business or a large business, conglomerate, whatever it is. It makes it very difficult to stay on top because the techniques are changing constantly. So one of the things that you can do is just number one is just you have to make sure that we were talking about this earlier about how you need to secure your data. So securing your data is important, right? And obviously going and doing all of the password things that we talked about and using good habits, trying to look at links and not get phished. All that stuff is a part of it, but making sure that you store your data in an encrypted disk. So, like for instance, on your local hard drive on your computer, at your Mac or your Windows PC, you have encryption software where the entire disk can be encrypted and it can only be unlocked, essentially using a passphrase, et cetera. You want to make sure that that's all encrypted, right? So if somebody were to take your drive or steal the computer, et cetera, that all of that information, would be secured and they wouldn't be able to access it necessarily, right? They couldn't just go in there and willy-nilly start pulling out files from the file system because it's all encrypted. So that's number one. Number two, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you realize that, if you have a small business, everything that you're doing in some way, shape, or form is being monitored. Anything online, all of it is being watched, right? And it's not necessarily watched even by a human. It's being watched by essentially there's very sophisticated, what we call machine learning algorithms You hear the buzzwords, machine learning and artificial intelligence. And more importantly, we have something called crawlers, where you have crawlers crawling the web looking for things, and we don't use them just in cybersecurity to detect nefarious sources. Hackers use them too, right? They want to go and figure out if a website is particularly vulnerable, et cetera. So for the business owner, it's important to just make sure that, number one, that any hosting service that they're using, that's worth their salt, has a good cybersecurity plan in place. The first thing I would ask is, if I'm going to host my site with you, tell me what you're doing to secure my information as I put it up here. So just making sure that you're working with a reputable source, not necessarily the cheapest source. But like, for instance, I like Shopify for a lot of businesses, because Shopify does a lot with cybersecurity. They do a lot to prevent, for instance, defacements of websites, where somebody will literally just, it's all about, it might be a political message, social justice message. It could be, I just want to gain access and just deface the site. It might be trying to use very sophisticated techniques to monitor transactions. There's a lot of different things, but just making sure you're using a good site with your small business, a good hosting site is going to go a long way.
Do you have any recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, beyond Shopify, I mean, that's obviously one of the better ones you can use. It makes getting online. It's a little expensive, but ultimately, some of that cost goes into the money that they spend on cybersecurity. So when people see a $78, $80 a month bill, for the service, they kind of go, "Whoa, that's a lot of money." It's not, when you think about all the things that they're doing to protect you. Um, but there's a number of things: AWS, Amazon Web Services, or Google Cloud Platform, what we call GCP. Those are all very. There's of course Microsoft Azure as well, and those are all big platforms where you can, host your, for instance, your applications, and host your information. And of course, working with those teams is good. So I would effectively make sure that the first thing you do is have a good cyber strategy. Even if you're kind of a small business and don't have people looking into it, you have to have somebody looking into it for you. It's impossible to do it alone. So those services tend to be cheaper, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's not a dedicated staff, but they're doing so much with cybersecurity, the odds are you're going to probably be okay.
Yeah, not everyone is so lucky like me. I have my own dedicated server guy, Dukas, to just do it at home and making sure everything is good. So, any last minute or tidbits that you would love to provide for our listeners to say, hey, here's the things that we could do? I mean, you've already given so much in terms of like what you should do as a habit, a good hygiene to do when it comes to securing your data from, getting hacked and all that, even when and phishing. Is there any other thing that a person, a regular person, or a small business owner that could do to make sure that they are preventing themselves from getting hacked?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things, right? So first off, social media is kind of, unfortunately, it's really kind of the death of us all, because people tend to be very, very, again, this is human nature. They tend to be very relaxed online. So, I personally, if you're going to be online and you're going to, people will say, well, I want to put a picture up of myself, or I want to do this, I want to do that. You're better off using a little bit of anonymity, a little bit of privacy. Don't post where you work. Don't post pictures of yourself all the time. And if you do it in a way that you're not giving a bunch of free leeway to a hacker to steal that information and use it against you later. What people don't realize is, a lot of times, these attacks that we see, they're not perpetrated overnight. Somebody's building a dossier slowly of your habits. They're watching you. And in the average person, that's not usually what's going on, because you're really probably not a target, right? The thing that the hacker wants from the average person is credentials. They want access to the financials. They want credit card numbers first and foremost. They want to go ruin your credit. They want to get access to your bank accounts, things like that. But we don't want to put things that they can go and, for instance, if some question is asked about about maybe like a security question, well, all somebody has to do is go look at your Facebook page, and they can get a lot of what they need and just right off of what's being publicly available on your social media accounts. So making sure that you're a little anonymous, that's okay to do that. I wouldn't necessarily post pictures of myself, and if you do, that's fine, but do so tactfully. Making sure that you don't put all of your information in the profile, where you work, where you went to school, things like that. The other thing, is kind of, we talked a little bit about kind of that analogy about the house, and really this gets down to hygiene again. This gets down to using good habits, right? So think of it like this: no matter how secure a system is, no matter what it is, it's only as secure as the human securing it, right? So if, say, for instance, I'm a wealthy person and I go and I build a big, beautiful house and I put a huge 12-foot wall around the house, that's all fine and dandy. But if I'm leaving my front door open, if I'm leaving my windows open, if I'm leaving my windows unlocked, well, now I've just breached myself, because my lax habits now have provided free entry into anybody who wants to scale that wall. Now, ideally, what we want is we want some type of system or some type of help to kind of alert us to these types of things, right? Hey, maybe you're busy, you got a heavy schedule, you forgot and left your front door unlocked, you forgot and left your windows unlocked. And so some of the more sophisticated cyber security prevention mechanisms out there will use artificial intelligence and machine learning to literally make a prediction based on your particular habits or habits that are going on in your environment. So you want to try to make sure, again, that you're informing yourself, but at the same time, you're taking full advantage of these techniques, and things like just using, the things we talked about, but some of these applications like Kaspersky, things like that, they all employ cybersecurity mechanisms that use ML and AI. And so these things are going to maybe take a look at some of the things that you're doing on your computer. Well, you haven't changed your password in about 6 months. It's going to tell you that. It's going to tell you that, for instance, that you have a tendency to, maybe you're going to a website that's not HTTPS, meaning it's not secure, HTTP secure, or it's not, there's going to be things that you're doing that it's going to watch. And so you want to invest in good antivirus or total security software for your endpoint. And that could be in the form of, another great one is something called Malwarebytes. That's another one that's really good. Hitman Pro is another good one. So these are different things that you can use on your local PC to help you out. But ultimately, right, we have to be able, no matter what we're trying to do, we have to be able to have some visibility into our habits, because we live busy lives and we can't do it on our own sometimes.
True. I don't have to do it. You had to do it. So I'm lucky, that's for sure, but not everyone is so lucky. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate you being here, and we will see you soon for sure. All right. Have a
Okay.
wonderful day, everyone.